Good morning, everyone. My name's Shaun Spiers from Green Lions. Welcome to this webinar on a great new book produced by the broadcaster and presenter of Countryfile and Brave Earth and many other programs, Tom Heap, Land Smart. Welcome, Tom. Thank you for joining us. The last report I was involved in producing when I was at CPRE 7 years ago was on shaping UK land use, and the first words in the report were why, the rhetorical question, why are we not more interested in the land? And you clearly are interested in the land. I just wonder if you could say what motivated you to write the book, and perhaps a kind of a quick overview of some of its messages, and then we'll drill down into various parts of it.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you very much for having me on here. I wrote this book because I've spent, around 25 years looking at issues to do with environment, rural affairs, science, climate, all those things. And in recent years, I was particularly struck by how everyone was looking to the land for solutions. We had the phrase land-based solutions, nature-based solutions and things in order to solve climate and nature problems in particular. And at the same time, we have a growing global population. Whether it's right or wrong, we have a growing demand for meat. And all these things are putting enormous pressure on land. So it used to be simple in the past. We just wanted land to do farming and maybe provide some space for shelter for us. And yes, obviously later roads and business, etc. But now we want it to capture carbon, for instance. We want it to generate energy off land area. We want it to produce maybe biomaterials off land area. We want space for recreation, obviously space for nature, space for water storage to prevent flooding. And that's before you get to the warehouses and the houses and everything else besides. So I thought there was an interesting pressure, if you like, a space race out there for the land. And I was also aware, the frequent slogan, we only have one planet, or the sort of calculation that we need 3 planets in order to satisfy our material demands and things like this. So I was really interested to go out and see what the challenges, trade-offs, and most importantly, meet people who I think are either close to or groping towards a solution to this problem. And whilst this isn't particularly a polemical book, I hope it's more of a sort of a practical book, a look at what works and who's making it work. There are 1 or 2 sort of guiding thoughts that come out within it, a few principles that I think do stand up.
Great. Well, we'll drill down into those, and I'm aware that I've also totally failed to tweet at hashtag GA event, and also to put your questions in the Q&A box and upvote the most popular. But a lot of the book, of course, is about farming, because most of the land take is for farming, and sometimes the debates there can be pretty binary between rewilding or growing food or whatever. But it's undoubtedly the case that we have a nature as well as a climate crisis, which you draw attention to. You have a bucket full of statistics, I think is the phrase, on nature loss, and say the overwhelming driver of this loss has been the growth in farmland across the planet, that is. Obviously, some uses of land are contentious, and the one I thought where you really kind of were most outspoken was biofuels, where you say you talk about an absence of any redeeming features for almost any biofuel used on a large scale. Biofuels are the bad apple, a dumb use of land, eroding the natural world and human food supply. Why is it so hard to get this argument across? Because we have a constant debate now about food security, and people say we can't afford to rewild land for nature, and yet we're using all this land for biofuels across the world.
Yeah. Just roll back a tiny bit, and I will absolutely come back to what you said. So just on the farming and land use question, it's widely agreed by people who look at this that the worst thing we can do for the nature and climate crisis is take more land globally under the cow or under the plow. That came particularly from IPBES, which people may know is the sort of biodiversity equivalent to the IPCC for climate. IPBES does for nature. And interviewed Bob Watson, who was ran it for a while, and he was very, very clear that we mustn't take more land into farming. And the World Resources Institute very much say the same thing, because not only are you depriving space for nature and wildlife, but also it tends to be that land use change from something natural to farming that releases a lot of carbon dioxide. And then, of course, you've got the practice of farming, which normally, not obligatory, but normally releases carbon dioxide as well. So that's why I'm so worried about expanding the footprint of farming. And we'll come on to the sort of maybe the yield question later, and the fact that unlike a lot of books of environmental nature, I do actually have a lot of respect for yield. However, on biofuels, as you say, there are really a few problems. Let's start with the fact that a lot of them, for a lot of them, their climate credentials are shaky at best. By the time you've included the fertilizer that went into them, the tractor traffic, all the other chemicals, et cetera, the release of nitrous oxide if you're using fertilizer, and other carbon from the soil if you're on peat, which some are. We've got maize grown on peat going into biodigesters to create energy and attracting subsidy to do that. What's going on there? So climate credentials dubious. Land use take potentially enormous. I was just looking at this today again, because in the King's speech there is mention of sustainable aircraft fuels. Now, they don't currently say what these are, but in the language of the industry, sustainable aircraft fuels includes biofuel. It is, at the moment, if you looked at the energy demand from aviation and made that the equivalent of food, aviation at the moment around the world takes the equivalent of 1,200 calories per head. Now, I just want to be clear, we as people need 2,500 calories per head. At the moment, if all our aviation fuel was made from crops, it would be the equivalent of half total global food demand. It's a ridiculous quantity. Oh, there's another way of looking at this that's reckoned that to power the aviation that flies around within America, you'd need the whole land area of America. So if we start demanding or using biofuels, particularly in aviation, we are just going to grab masses of land off nature. We've already seen this with biofuels and biofuel mandates in the European Union, which we signed up to at the time, that things like biodiesel and our petrol have a certain proportion, I think it's 10% of a bio component within them. There's little doubt that has helped to kill off orangutans in Indonesia, because palm oil is one of the ingredients that goes into biodiesel. We just got to stop that. And the final thing is that in comparison to other land uses to make energy, wind and solar, it is woefully inefficient. It's difficult to make the calculation for wind, because wind arguably is difficult to say how much land it takes up. But if you look at solar, you can do that because it actually needs an area under the sun. By any measure, you get 50 times, if not more, energy from solar per unit area than you do from a biofuel. And this is because, although photosynthesis is the foundation equation for life on Earth, I feel a bit rude saying it, but it's not terribly efficient. And so it's actually a bad way of turning sunlight into power. If you want to turn sunlight into power, put a solar panel on it. And it's particularly ironic because, indeed, some farmers will complain about when they see solar panels. Obviously, we need to be growing food, not solar. We grow a far greater area of biofuels in this country than we'd have of solar panels. It's a little bit difficult to say, but people reckon it's in the region of 5 to 10 times more area of that. So physics are in the wrong place, and the actual calculations of climate change in the wrong place, and the land use change is potentially punishing. Basically, for biofuels on virgin crop, don't do it.
And I'm fascinated by why that argument is so hard to get across. I mean, solar, I think you say less than 1,000th of UK land is currently under solar panels, but a huge controversy about solar. I think it was in the Conservative manifesto to ban solar on farmland. The former president of the NFU, Minette Batters, was vehemently opposed to solar on farmland. And I wonder why we don't look at biofuels politically. It's not a huge issue, and yet we do fixate about solar. Is it because people love the landscapes they love and they're more noticeable? Is it because farmers like growing crops and don't regard solar as a crop? I mean, what do you think it is?
Well, with solar, I think you're absolutely right. It's a very clearly visible change of land use, and people don't look like it looking silvery black and shiny rather than green and wavy that it was, excuse me, when the crops were there. So that's undoubtedly true. There are areas where I think we need to be very careful about putting, in fact, probably say that putting solar on productive farmland is a bad thing. I don't say that solar should go everywhere. I think it should be scrutinized, and we can talk about the other sort of multifunctioning things you can do with solar a little bit later, but I don't give it a free pass on farmland by any means. But I think it is that sort of visible, if you like, NIMBY thing, which needs to be addressed. It's also not farming, and farmers like farm. Well, you can combine it with farming, but on the whole, it's not farming. And I think the final thing is biofuels, I confess in the book how I was totally seduced by biofuels at the beginning as someone who's concerned about the climate, but also occasionally likes, accelerating fast in Saabs. I get that. And if you're a farmer, particularly, Midwest corn farmer, you see biofuels as another massive market. And there's a real danger, particularly in aviation, that the phenomenally powerful farming and corn lobby in the States is going to push very hard for their crop to end up in the fuel tanks of aircraft.
Yes, and environmentalists don't get a clear pass either on the early enthusiasm for biofuels. I've not seen much enthusiasm recently. Just on solar, one of the things I was constantly thinking in the book. So the book contains lots of examples of sort of pioneering people, really interesting farmers or energy pioneers, and so on. And all the time, because Green Alliance is a public policy think tank, I was thinking, what does this mean for public policy? And one of the clearest areas, though I kind of get frustration rather than a clear answer from you, is the failure to put solar panels on buildings, and particularly on warehouses. And you say there is surely a role for government to bring the players together to find a way through, which is sort of, I think, is my conclusion as well. But I wonder if you have some sense of why we just fail to put solar panels on warehouses.
So there are. I think generally, the reason this matters so much is actually the area of warehouse roofs is phenomenal and is growing. And forgive me, I wouldn't know without exactly looking it up, but I think it's something like between a half and a third of our future solar demand, which I think is enormous. I think it's 5 times our current capacity, could be met by putting stuff on warehouse roofs. So I think it matters in that sense. It also matters because I understand people saying quite rightly, how come it's in the field here when it's not on the warehouse over there, or indeed it's not permitted in my roof? Maybe I've got some sort of conservation thing on the house, and there are all sorts of things. So we haven't taken the shackles off that nearly enough. Although, to be fair, there is quite a bit of solar on roofs. There could be so much more. And so why hasn't this happened, particularly on things like warehouses? Well, there are a series of bad, although possibly understandable but bad reasons, and that's because things like a new warehouse has a complicated ownership and operation structure. There's someone who might operate the land, there's someone who built the building, there's someone who owns the building, there's someone who leases the building, then there's the person who uses the building within, and then there's someone else, another company may be responsible for the maintenance and another insurer, etc., etc. So it's not as simple as me, and I'm looking out at them here, out of this window, but my panels on my roof, I am the sole decision maker. Easy. lots of people, difficult. But that to me is a heads banging together exercise that government could definitely be involved in. The boss of the UK Warehousing Association, Claire Bottle, she's totally on board for this. She really wants to get it going. To be fair to the former government, they were groping towards this. I remember talking to Grant Shapps when he was in that department before he roughly got shifted around, but he was actually quite in favour of some of this, and they were moving towards this. So that's the one reason that I think should be definitely overcomable. The more complicated one, and arguably more physically real one, is our old friend, the grid. The fact that a lot of warehouses are in places where the grid connections are not good enough. I've spoken to operators who said, look, I'd love it. I actually, I investigated it, and the grid told me, maybe in 2040, that sort of thing. So the government has influence over both those things quite clearly. It can get people around the table, it can bang heads together, and it can also help with investment, of course, make the grid more amenable to getting these things connected.
Yeah, and with a government that's got as its sort of main mission growth and productivity and so on, the stat in your book is that the industry could save £3 billion a year from reducing their energy bills and selling into the grid.
And just the other thing, as transport becomes more electrified, particularly trucks, and that you actually got an even better use case, because just like they plug their back ends into the buildings and fill up with stuff, they can plug their batteries into the buildings and fill up with electricity. It feels like such a potential synergy, such potential synergies there.
Yeah, well, add that to the quite large agenda of the new government. We can move on back to sort of farming and nature. And a lot of the book is about nature, and I'm just quite interested in your career as an environmental journalist. If you can think about the salience of nature as an issue, I think for most environmental groups now, we would say that we got a double crisis: nature and climate. The two are interchangeable. You can't address one without the other, and we give a lot of prominence to nature. And of course, the sector includes the National Trust, the Wildlife Trust, the RSPB, Woodland Trust, etc. So there's lots of big nature NGOs. But it kind of wasn't like that 15 years ago, was it? It was all climate, climate, climate. Or am I misremembering?
I think there's been a bit of a journey here. I mean, the original NGOs, I would say, were very nature, RSPB, Save the Rainforest, etc. That sort of tone was very based on, our natural world. I think because it felt more of a novelty and more of an existential crisis when the climate crisis, loomed in the sort of, particularly in the public imagination from the sort of mid-90s, let's say, through, well, I'd argue till now, although disappointingly, it's possibly taken a dip in the last year. And I know some of the people involved in nature have felt a little shoved out of the nest. So I think there is a bit of a transition there. I mean, I would just say, I am very concerned about nature in the book, but I think we do need to be concerned about it globally. Having had a little bit of a criticism of some farming lobby groups earlier on, I am actually pretty convinced by some of the things that the National Farmers Union say about the danger, or the irresponsibility, perhaps is the better word, of exporting our food demand overseas and having a gorgeous parkland here. It just doesn't really make sense to me. I've got that map that came from the Dimbleby food strategy of what we grow in Britain and the size of the offshore island we have currently, the imaginary offshore island, i.e. the rest of the world, that we demand supplies our food. I don't think it's responsible to increase the size of that offshore island because we cannot guarantee the environmental and nature and climate credentials under which that was produced. So that's why I do respect yield. And this is possibly the hardest challenge in the book, is how do we deliver the same, if not more, food from the same land whilst shrinking our demand for fertilizer and chemicals, which have punishing environmental, in the nature and climate sense, punishing environmental impacts. How do we do that? Now, I think some people are beginning to do that, but it is tough. But I do think we need to bear that in mind, and that's where I part company from some of my fellow authors on environment, probably.
Yeah, and I thought that was a really interesting part of the book. And you mentioned the Dimbleby National Food Strategy. So that explicitly calls for a 3-compartment model for production, where you, on the most productive arable farmland, you do go for yield, and you say here, yield matters, we need to produce more with less. Dimbleby and Green Alliance would agree with that on the high yielding arable farmland. Then there's a whole lot of pastoral land, which Dimbleby report says do agroecology. You can get double benefits. You can grow food, but you can also increase nature. On the high yielding land, you should also be farming in as a regenerative way as possible, and you give some examples in the book there. And then the third compartment, which is the really controversial one, is rewilding. The 20% of the land that produces 3% of our calories, let some of that go for nature. And I was interested that you didn't explicitly call for 3 compartments. I know some people don't like it. It sounds too schematic. And you also say that regenerative farming as a term is too vague in its definition. Rewilding is unhelpful because it puts people's backs up. But I wonder if you do have a vision for how you divide against farmland.
I don't have many prescriptions on public policy, because this isn't predominantly a sort of public policy book. It's more going to meet people who I think are doing smart things with land, and then I hope that can help to inform public policy experts. I think actually what I say about regen farming is a lot of people criticize it for being a bit vague and open-sided. I actually don't mind that myself, because I think actually at core it does have a definition, which is, each year you should be leaving your land and your soil regenerated, i.e. in a better way than it was before. And the fact that it's open-sided and doesn't prescribe against chemicals, doesn't prescribe against biotechnology in quite the sort of hard-edged way, I think is a good thing. I welcome that, because I think it's a pragmatic answer to that. I mean, 3 compartments, yeah, it's a bit too harsh for me, but I am broadly in sympathy with that. I mean, one of the areas that I do think, upland farming is tricky to justify. Not completely, not everywhere, and I'm not in favor of total rewilding of these uplands, because I think there is room for a patchwork. But if you look at a lot of our uplands, I think if they were in another country, we might call them degraded land, because they're not really, a lot of them, not all, a lot of them are not doing a lot of food production. They're not doing a lot of energy production. They're not doing a lot of nature production. They're not doing a lot of water storage. They're not doing a lot of carbon storage. What are they doing? Not enough of anything. And I think that is something that really needs to be examined. I think there's huge potential there to use them in a more productive way for one or all of those outcomes.
So let's go through the three compartments one by one. You've dealt really there with rewilding. You're right, by the way, regenerative agriculture. You quote somebody and I misattributed it to you, so I'll just look that up. Apologies for that. But on rewilding, one of the things that's interesting was it sort of peppered through the book is just a lot of hostility from farmers to that very notion. Or is it the notion, or is it the word? The idea that we really need to grow food in this country. It's a sin to not do so on land.
It's the word that embodies the notion, because by its definition, it's kind of the polar opposite of farming, isn't it? So if you've trained and indeed arguably got an element of self-worth from the value of doing that farming thing, then rewilding looks like saying it's much better to leave it alone and all your skills are worthless. You can sort of see why that would rub people up the wrong way. However, I mean, I talked to Alistair Driver, therefore, about whether it was a useful term, because he himself, very readily admits that actually rewilding is a spectrum. It's not a sort of hard destination. He said, we'll never get to full rewilding in this country while we don't have top carnivores, massive herbivores, massive areas of land, all that, So it is a spectrum, as I say. So therefore I asked him, well, given that it's so polarizing, is it still useful as a term? His view is that it still is, because it kind of, a lot of people understand kind of what it means, or the direction of travel that it implies. But it was quite interesting, a lot of rewilded areas. It's a bit like if you have a wildflower patch in your garden, it needs a heck of a lot of management. The idea that you're just going to, put up a fence and walk away is generally not how nearly all rewilding in this country works. You have to have the intention to sort of leave it alone sometime in the future, but it's not often a question of, shut the gate and just let it do its thing. It usually requires a lot more management than that, certainly in the early years and possibly decades.
Yeah, I was amused by your observation that the wildflower patch in your garden is the thing you find hardest to tend, which I think anybody who's got one of those sort of packets of wildflower seeds at an event and then try to plant them will.
It's all right if you like nettles and brambles and bindweed, which is what happens, which is maybe the true definition of wild in this country.
That sort of describes my garden. So on the highly productive land, I thought what was very interesting is sort of two observations there. One was about farmers who are sort of hooked on chemicals, partly because they're reliant on the advice of their agronomists who are hooked on chemicals, and you say it's a bit like being friends with your local drug dealer, and also observe that coming off chemicals is extremely painful, because you take a few years to get the yield back up and to get into profit. But that does seem a ripe area for public policy as we move from the Common Agricultural Policy to new Environmental Land Management Scheme, is just to help farmers who want yield but want to do it without polluting rivers and killing insects and so on.
Public policy, and I think it would be fair to say that the regime for farming subsidy has been groping towards this direction since we left the EU, with the sustainable farming incentive, a much greater respect for soil. I also think it's an enormous potential for science, because at the moment, the varieties that farmers have the option of planting are either chemically dependent varieties, quite literally bred to be addicted to the drug that they're fed, very shallow roots because all their chemicals are on the surface. They don't need to bother with going down. And they don't need to bother to make relationships with fungus, which under normal circumstances is basically how you find the nitrogen to grow if you're a cereal crop. So farmers have either got modern chemically dependent varieties or things that come from the 19th century. There is scope, huge scope, and I've spoken for science to really get on board with this and try and produce varieties which are for today's regenerative system, and work very, very hard on that. I think the other area, which is a sort of science techno area, is fertilizers that are not made relying on the Haber-Bosch process, the famous chemical equation that emits a lot of energy, a lot of carbon and other gases itself, and it releases a lot of nitrogen in the field. Now, there are, once again, companies that are doing this and are producing fertilizers with much, much lower carbon footprint. And some of these are certified by the Carbon Trust, and others, they're good. But actually, that brings me on to one of the third player in this, which is business. Funnily enough, the companies that have shown the most enthusiasm for these low climate impact fertilizers are some of the big companies out there, like PepsiCo and Nestle and Cargill, who are, I don't always put on the virtuous step. But in this case, they are the ones, you could argue they've got the money to experiment, or you could argue that they've got the exposure and the concern about climate in their supply chain, that they are really beginning to put pressure on to change that. And so I think there is a role for big food business as well in this. So as well as public policy, I'd definitely include those other ones as well, in terms of science and academia, sort of engineering stroke fertilizer, and indeed businesses in the food retail sector themselves. I think they have levers to pull.
Yeah, and it is extraordinary stat in your book that fertilizers are responsible for 3% of human-made climate change, about the same as aviation. So it really does need to be addressed. I think you talked earlier about your challenge to some environmentalists not to want perfection in the UK at the expense of offshoring our environmental footprint. I think you're also a bit critical of the technophobia of some environmental groups. You talk about replacing chemistry with biology, selective breeding, gene editing, etc., breeding crops for lower input. I guess the charge of some people, some organic advocates and so on, would be that this is just a new way, the next step of playing God, removing ourselves from natural processes, and so far. I wonder how you respond to that.
My view of the power of biotechnology, be it up to a point conventional breeding, but certainly gene editing and genetic modification, is that, and this is a bit of a cliche, but it's a tool, and it's a powerful tool. It's like a chainsaw. You can do terrible things with a chainsaw, but you can also do very productive things very quickly. It's a vital tool. It gets a job done, and it gets it done quickly, and sometimes you can't do it in any other way. And that's what I feel about genetic modification. Sure, it needs assessment on case-by-case basis. No one would disagree with that. But I think to exclude it is really strange, especially at a time when I think we need to look more to biology and less to chemistry as a way of addressing these problems. And, as I mentioned in the book, there's a guy working there who is called Giles Oldroyd, who is trying to have cereals, and our staple crops in this world are cereals, wheat, maize, rice, to try and have them fix their own nitrogen in the same way that the so-called legumes can have, beans and peas and things like this, which means they can get fertilizer from the air. Now, if he's actually doing that predominantly for farmers who can't afford fertilizer, those in the global south who can't afford it at all, and therefore have terrible yields. Now, I think that is a really exciting potential development. I think it'll take years. It may not work at all. In the meantime, they're working on a lot of other things that aren't quite so seismic, but still help in making plants better adapted to crops better adapted to a regenerative farming system. And I think that's enormously powerful. I mean, science delivered the green revolution and the dependence on chemicals that we got. Now, you can criticize that, but it was kind of successful in its own terms, and almost certainly is keeping between a half and a third of the population of the world alive today. So, I believe that science has power in this space, and we should be harnessing it to do the right thing, which is probably more biology and soil based rather than the wrong thing, which we now know is the wrong thing, that it is all chemical based.
Yeah, and I think the scientist you quote he sort of expresses frustration that he's one of the good guys, and everybody thinks he's one of the bad guys working with big
Not everybody, but certainly a lot of groups. Yeah.
Yeah. So back to just the last point on sort of arable farming, and again, this is an area where I think you're refreshingly honest, because there's no easy answer, which is peat. Because growing crops on peat is, it's really, really productive farmland, and it's really, really damaging to the climate. And well, I was going to read out your solution, but you tell me your solution.
I don't know if you can read it out if you've got it there, because I don't have it on the tip of my tongue. I mean, it is a really difficult one. It's the most productive area of food, and it's the most punishing in terms of climate change, or certainly one of the most punishing. And simply being able to go to some of these areas of deep peat that we've been farming and see how much they've disappeared. And you can see this in these famous home posts, these posts that were put in, I think it's around a century ago, possibly a little more. And, the level of the peat has gone down by meters. You can go to farms and people were saying, look, I built that road, or I built that barn 25 years ago at the ground level. And now you can see that the ground level is below it by up to a meter. And you just think, wow, that's actually not only productive farmland going up into the atmosphere, but it's a literal demonstration of something that has become climate change. So problematic, but extremely productive. So, I mean, I think there are some I wouldn't necessarily say solutions. There are some ways of reducing this through wetting the peat. So it's drying peat, which basically allows it to oxidize and therefore contribute to climate change. You can wet the peat to either completely and grow some crops that thrive in a wet peat environment. None of those at the moment are looking like big food yielders. You can wet it to a little bit shallower, and a lot of people are looking at that and still grow some pretty productive crops within it, but it's difficult with machinery, and it's difficult if your neighbors aren't doing it, because how do you control the water table and all these kind of things? But you're still emitting, some carbon. Or you can go, there's a chap who's doing this thing called reverse coal, which is an interesting idea, where he's basically planting woody biomass. He's re-wetting the peat, planting woody biomass, i.e. willow or stuff like that in it. When that's grown, harvesting that, putting it in a biochar maker, which is basically a charcoal maker. You pyrolyze it, so you give off some CO2, which you'd then help, some of the heat and some of the CO2 would go into a polytunnel for food growing, and some of the biochar would go back in the soil as a form of carbon capture and as a sort of growth promoter. There's a lot in what I just said. You can see that it's difficult, very difficult to, and sort of innovative to make farming on peat truly climate friendly. But it's very productive, and you've got to look at where that food would come from if you didn't grow it from peat. One of the final arguments about peat that comes particularly from those who farm there is that because we need a lot less no fertilizer on peat because it's so fertile, our footprint is less in that sense. One of the stray arguments, which I think is an interesting one to apply almost as a thought experiment, is if we had a carbon tax on farming, like we have on some other highly polluting industries, what impact that metric would have.
Yes, that's a really interesting question. Just back on peat. So what you basically just say that we've got to do something about it. It's a real puzzler, you say, but we've got to wean ourselves off it, not least because it's disappearing anyway. And I'm sure that's true. Some of the uses of peat, of course, domestic peat for gardens should just be banned, but also if you're growing crops that you're then feeding to biofuels or animals, again, that seems pretty indefensible. The last area in terms of the three compartments would be agroecology, trying for smaller flocks, a bit of destocking on pasture land. All these arguments about finding more space for nature and addressing climate change through our land use, they all rest to an extent on diet change. And you are unequivocal in your love of meat, and you sense it's important to our culture and an important part of many people's diets and so on. I also eat meat, but I think you would agree we all need to eat less, and that there's a role for government in not any longer shying away from that conversation.
I love of meat. I think I'm not sure if that's a phrase I use, but I do eat it, but I do eat a lot less than I used to, and I've been able to do that for a bunch of reasons. The most obvious is because vegetarian options, vegetarian knowledge, vegetarian menus have become better, and so the alternative is more attractive. I have a little bit of self-will, and so I'm able to be influenced by what I know is the impact of meat. So I definitely reduced that, and I don't think that's a particularly well, no, what am I going to say? I don't think it's for the likes of me, I haven't found it particularly hard. However, generally, I do think behavioral change is really hard to achieve. And so I absolutely acknowledge that all these things that we've talked about the productive side are seen in the context of the demand side, which is diet, as you've just indicated, certainly in farming. And so it's not just actually about eating less meat, it's about eating less altogether. It's about also wasting less. Those are the other two big things in this dietary demand space, and we need to look at all those. On the meat side, I do think there is a role not for government to instruct, and I'm not a favour of a meat tax. I think those things are just politically impossible, because people sometimes compare it to, oh, we managed to change behaviours on wearing seatbelts or smoking or something like that. Those are trivial in comparison to diet and food. It's so embedded in our culture, in our sense of ourselves, in our sense of pleasure. Meals for a lot of people, it's just still around the world, somewhat under half the world's population of farmers, so it's very embedded in it's a completely different scale of behavioral change to those two other things. However, I don't think that means we shouldn't nudge and do things to try and achieve it. And I think making it clear that both usually for health and certainly for environment, lower meat diets would be a good thing. I think governments shouldn't shy away from saying that. I mean, it's that famous Michael Pollan advice, isn't it, when it comes to diet? Eat real food, not too much, mainly plants. I mean, it still stands up, that analysis. So I think that's something that we should be brave enough to do. And just one thing I like to say on this, actually, this came up in connection with my previous book, 39 Ways to Save the Planet, which was about climate change solutions, which for various reasons I won't go into, I ended up getting the preface written and going to interview Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I knew he wasn't very keen on the sort of sacrificial side of environmentalism, giving things up, not his bag, really. And I came to diet, and I said, I understand you've given up a lot of meat. Isn't that a sacrifice? Isn't that giving up something? And he said, no, it's not. I eat 70% less meat, but it's not a sacrifice because I've gained my health. My doctor says I've gained another 2 years of lifespan. He goes on to say how he then should give up cigar smoking, but that's another thing. The point is, it isn't impossible. If even Arnie can see this as something that isn't necessarily a sacrifice, necessarily a hardship, then I think there is hope that the rest of us could as well.
Yeah, really interesting. He better remain nameless, but I was speaking to a Labour MP while Labour was in opposition about diet change, and saying, of course, you'll not do anything about, you won't want to say anything about this because it's too controversial, and you'll end up all over the Daily Mail. And he said, well, he'd called a event about diet in his constituency, which was twice oversubscribed, with mums who are worried about their kids' dentistry, fitness, etc., etc.
Just a very short observation on that. I mean, one thing that it does come in the book, and I think it came from Tim Benton from Chatham House, he said, look, governments are going to have to do this because the health problems we've got with diets, and possibly the global insecurity problems of free global trade are going to mean we have to look at these things, but particularly the health and diet thing. Whether you like it or not, the crises in diet means governments are going to have to get bolder in this space.
Great. So let's go to some questions, and do upvote them or add your questions now. But one I think which is relevant to this, it says from Andrew Meredith, why has this debate, I'm not sure if this is the debate just about diet or generally about land use, but why has this debate become a significant part of the wider culture wars, and what can be done to extract it?
That's Andrew Meredith of Farmers Weekly, editor thereof, I think. He probably feels it more keenly than I do, of farmers. I'm a bit, what's the phrase? I'm a bit less convinced that things are culture war-y than journalists and others would have us believe, because the culture warriors, they dominate the media in this space, particularly the social media in this space, because we all know anger gets amplified. That's the way it works. I'm not convinced that overall there isn't room that these extreme voices really represent where most people are. I'll just say that I'm not convinced from the start. But I think as to why it does trigger those feelings, it's because of a couple of things that I mentioned earlier. If you're a farmer and you're faced with rewilding, it looks like a challenge to your very essence, your very self, your very skill set. And if this is about food and diet, then these are things that are, for a lot of people, fundamental to the way they enjoy their life, and they get identity from it. So I think that has something to do with it. I think the environmental movement bears some responsibility for this as well, because there's always well, not always, often a whiff with the environmental movement that it is a bit preachy. It is a bit sort of I'm virtuous, you're not. Now that's bound to exactly, that's bound to incite a sort of culture war type response, because you're sort of saying you're better than somebody else. So I think some of the responsibility for this lies on both sides. But I think it is possible to find ways through this, and I'm not sure that these culture war things. Actually, I think this particularly on climate, they're not as, in this country, they're not as deep rooted as some of the coverage would have you believe, or widespread as some of the coverage would have you believe.
I think perhaps you're not reading the Daily Mail and Daily Telegraph as much as I do, but
but they're very much, it's in their interest to ramp up this. You know,
right.
when I was, I mean, it was until recently, and I was doing a climate program on Sky that was basically an environment program. You know, my editor bosses always wanted me to talk about culture wars, always wanted me to talk, you know, dress it up in those terms, because it's catnip for journalists. It's about angry people with strong opinions. And, you know, that's easy copy. I'm not sure that it's, in fact, I am sure it is not the whole truth.
And just on diet change, is a question here saying, do you think it would be easier to get support for diet change by going through the health lens than the environmental lens? That's kind of what I'm hearing you suggest, but
almost certainly. But I've got no problem with putting the environmental stuff out there.
yeah.
I think, you know, it should be out there, and at least put the information out, and you know, allow people to begin to make their own decisions. If you want a controversy there, I've got another one for you, which is that when it comes to waste, which we didn't mention that much, I think it's hard to seriously tackle waste while we demand that food is cheaper and cheaper and cheaper.
Yeah, and I thought the sections on waste in the book were really interesting, but I didn't focus on it just because I kind of bought your line that it's really difficult to tackle. It's easy to say we waste all this amount. It's much harder to have a compelling argument that without major changes, we're going to waste less. But thinking from first principles about how do we create a circular economy in every respect would, I guess, drive us in that direction, which the new government is keen on. A question here from Gareth Morgan from the Soil Association. We need to own our own footprint and move away from our import dependence, including imports like synthetic nitrogen. But if the national sustainable output, broadly speaking, using agroecological approaches, is different from what we currently consume, how will that shift happen? That's a difficult question.
Me, Gareth, I got a little bit lost in the middle of that.
Yeah, so did I.
I figure out not exactly. I guess the point is, how will that shift happen? Is that is that the kind of drift at the end there? I mean, look, I think one of the reasons I wrote the book, apart from the general reader, is to explain and lay out the challenges in trade-offs in land use as it relates to climate, environment, and food production. I hope that a new administration with an open mind will look at this and say, look, here are ways we can do this. They have a land use framework in their manifesto. It wasn't, I don't think, in the King's speech yesterday, but fair enough. It's a difficult thing to talk about straight away. And I'm also aware that for governments, it's quite easy for a land use framework to sound slightly Stalinist, just to sound slightly, you know, you will do this here and you will do that there. So they need to be I think they need to be a bit wiser about it before they start sort of thinking about what actions they should take. And the other thing that I feel really strongly, which we haven't quite talked about, one of the other mantras in the book is, where possible, make land do more than one thing at once. Multifunction your land. Now, this can happen, happens in my own garden. I've got recreation. I've got a house, excuse me, an own plot. I've got a house where I live. I've got recreation. I've got space for nature. I've got carbon storage, so I've become obsessed by my soils, and I never let the council take any green waste away anymore. It all goes back on my land. And I've got panels on my roof, so multifunction there. But, some arable farmers are capturing carbon as well as being very productive arable farmers. Great, multifunctioning. Some are storing water as well, another multifunction. Obviously, nature as well. We talked briefly about warehouses and solar panels earlier. So this idea of multifunctioning land, I think, is very persuasive. And actually, it came up in a Royal Society report that came out last year about land use, that we should multifunction that. And I think that's the other way to achieve or begin to achieve these changes. Look where we can get win-wins on the same patch.
Yeah, interestingly, the last Labour government was banged on endlessly about multifunctionality, and then the coalition came in 2010 and banned the word because it was ugly jargon. But unfortunately, I think they sometimes then ban the concept of trying to achieve things.
As jargon goes, I don't think multifunction is considerably more understandable than most. But anyway, go on.
Yeah, I think I'm right in thinking Caroline Spelman particularly disliked it. But anyway, it's obviously what we need and need to recognise.
Very wise people of putting things in the Q&A, I notice on that. So that's great.
Are they? I know. I think somebody's translated Gareth as saying, I think he means if people want to eat pineapples rather than kale, that's a bit tricky to grow in the UK.
Well,
discuss. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that is true. But does the market? I mean, one of the things I would like to see, this is not entirely off the point, is people often talk about labels on food, carbon labels, etc., etc. I think we should have a mandatory label of whether something was air freighted here or not. Simple as.
Yes, I did hear that Marks and Spencer's, when they said air freighted, their sales went up because people thought it was fresher. So
at least provide us with the info.
Yeah, I guess so.
I mean, not fine, but it's a clear piece of information. It's either it is or it isn't, and that's that.
So, question here from an anonymous attendee: can more be done to support farmers to manage more species-rich pastures and meadows that still produce nutrient-dense food, but also habitat for farmland, wildlife, and other public goods?
Can more be done? Yes, I think more can be done. I mean, I think there are some of the incentives within the Sustainable Farming Initiative do promote this. I mean, the farmers I spoke to in Wales, the upland farmers, who are my main evidence body there, they were doing this because they got subsidy for some of the natural things that they were doing from a variety of sources. Natural Resources Wales one, they actually got some from the national grid to do with offsetting the imposition of pylons close by. So they got money for that. And they also were investigating, and I think this is a big one for landowners, both biodiversity and carbon offsetting money. Another fantastically controversial topic, but there is definitely room, particularly in the nature space, for farmers and landowners to get money for promoting wildlife on their patch because it's been destroyed somewhere else.
Yes, there is a lot of money out there. There's also a lot of money potentially from water companies investing vast sums in
yeah, that's very true. Up their uplands, so their water catchments. Yeah, a good point.
If we can get the regulatory regime right. So one more question, and then I'll wrap up. But this is from Patrick Curry, I think, who suggests that food security is a major issue, but the environmental perspective is absent. Can Green Alliance and the BBC, there's a coalition, do more to raise the profile and awareness across the population on that? Well, certainly the BBC might be able to. I'm not sure that Green Alliance.
Just give me the first phrase of that again, please.
He says, right now there is a webinar taking place on national resilience, including the Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor for National Security. Food security is a major theme. i.e. a major theme on national security, but the environmental perspective is absent.
Well, I presume he means by that people are saying just, boost food security by chemically drenching everything, and that's the way to security. Well, I mean, that's just dumb, isn't it? I mean, it's incredibly short-sighted, literally short-termist in how long we'd be able to do it, how much it might cost us in terms of fertilizers, etc., what the outcome would be in terms of nature. So yeah, the environmental perspective clearly should be there, and I just don't. It has been presented as binary, but I actually don't think it's that complicated to say these are two things that or three things if you include nature, climate, and food production, that we value in our land, and we need to find ways of these three things working in harmony, not in opposition. And I think in my book, I've found quite a few people who are, if not achieving that totally, are close to achieving that or going in the direction of achieving that. And it's hard because it's about not having one single priority for your plot, which you're responsible for. It's about finding ways that two or three things can thrive off the same space. And that's where you need to be smart. That's the reason that smart is in the title of the book, Land Smart, because this is difficult. This is not straightforward. And one of the other things I sort of plea for towards the end of the book is a bit of a greater respect and admiration and investment in the skills of people who are working in this area, because balancing these things is really hard, and we need to invest it in the broadest sense, both with our pounds and our respect, more than we do currently.
Yeah, and I think what comes across really clearly throughout the book is both the kind of avoidance of binaries, don't set up oppositions falsely, but also try and have a little bit more respect between people whose priority is nature, people whose priority is food growing, and so on. I think that's really powerful. Just a very last question. I take it you seem quite optimistic. Maybe that's just your sunny personality, but that we can kind of huge problems, and they come out in the book. But are you optimistic that we can get this right?
Yes, I am. I'm excited. I'm always excited by these things, and I'm excited by people who are doing amazing and intelligent things, and I love meeting them. And I think they sort of represent what I think is a sort of great human qualities, which is of ingenuity and problem solving. And it's a bit like I felt when I was doing the previous book about climate change. I think we have the ways, we need to find the will. And because this is about change, when you get change in an existing ecosystem, you will, to a certain extent, you risk winners and losers, and to a certain extent you get winners and losers. So you need to be careful about managing that to make your transition plausible and hopefully well lubricated, rather than frictionful and eventually ground to a halt. And one of the things I felt a little bit towards the end of the last administration was that we were looking for the problems in all these things more than where the sort of synergies and solutions are. And it will be interesting to see if we can, concentrate more on those solutions, in which case, I think there is a room for hope. But I think it requires an acknowledgement that we do live in the Anthropocene and we do hold the levers here. And that is a scary thing, because we need to have the responsibility, to pull those levers in an effective way, both for us and for the nature of our planet and its climate.
Great, thank you, Tom. Really appreciate your time. Brilliant book, thoroughly recommended. Available in all good bookshops, and there's a link in the chat. And we will be producing this as a podcast and put on our YouTube channel later. So tell your friends. And thanks to the audience. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.